The signature on the divorce document was perfect, each letter of the name Laura Westfield traced with the same delicate precision with which she had learned to hide who she truly was during 7 years of marriage. Brandon didn't even look at his wife's face as he snatched the papers from her hands, his eyes fixed only on the confirmation of his freedom. Freedom to finally publicly acknowledge his relationship with Patricia Monroe, the corporate lawyer who paraded through Seattle in Louboutin heels and carrying bags that cost more than most people earned in a month. What Brandon didn't know, as he tucked those documents into his Italian leather briefcase, was that he had just signed his own sentence of ruin. Laura remained seated at the kitchen table of their Queen Anne home, watching her husband leave without a goodbye, without a final glance, without even a trace of hesitation. The morning light streamed through the panoramic windows, illuminating the carefully chosen furniture, the plants she watered every morning, the small details of a life she had built brick by brick while Brandon was busy demolishing it. 7 years. 7 years pretending not to see the messages on his phone, the late-night calls he took on the balcony, the scent that wasn't hers clinging to his shirts. 7 years of being called just a housewife at business dinners, being introduced with a condescending smile when he remembered to introduce her at all. The sound of the door closing echoed through the empty house. Laura closed her eyes and took a deep breath, finally allowing herself to feel the weight of all those years. She had chosen that simple life, away from the spotlight of the Westfield Pharmaceuticals empire, away from the crushing expectations of being the only daughter of Douglas Westfield. She had fallen in love with Brandon when he was just an ambitious analyst at Fletcher & Associates, a mid-sized consulting firm. He had seemed genuine then, impressed by her opinions on literature and art, not by her last name or bank account, because she had introduced herself only as Laura, the girl who worked at a small art gallery in Pike Place Market. She hadn't exactly lied, she had merely omitted. And when he proposed to her during an impromptu picnic in Discovery Park, Laura thought that maybe she could have a normal life, a true love that hadn't been bought or negotiated. She used her mother's maiden name, kept her money in discreet funds managed by lawyers in New York, and bought that house in Queen Anne through an LLC that Brandon never bothered to investigate. Why would he investigate? She was just Laura, the stay-at-home wife, who cooked, who smiled politely as he climbed the career ladder. The phone rang, interrupting her memories. It was Margaret Chen, her personal lawyer and longtime friend. "Is it done?" Margaret's voice was soft, but carried a maternal concern. "It's done." Laura stood up and walked to the window, observing the city that had been both her refuge and her prison. "He didn't even read the full terms, Margaret. He just signed. Men like Brandon never read between the lines. He thinks you have nothing, so why would he worry?" Margaret paused. "The stock transfer papers are ready. 48 hours after the divorce is finalized, he'll discover that Fletcher & Associates has a new majority shareholder." Laura felt a tightening in her chest. It wasn't revenge she sought, just justice. Just the recognition that her life, her time, her dreams also had value. Brandon had invested in the company using money she discreetly deposited into their joint account, saying it was savings from a fund her grandmother had left. Technically, it wasn't a lie. Her maternal grandmother had indeed left a fund. It was just considerably larger than the $200,000 she told Brandon. "What about the mansion in Medina?" Laura asked, referring to the $3 million property overlooking Lake Washington where Brandon planned to move with Patricia. "Also in your name, through the same LLC. The lease agreement he signed last year is under review. Technically, he has 30 days to vacate after the divorce is finalized." Margaret let out a satisfied sigh. "Your father would be proud, Laura, not for the revenge, but for your strength in finally defending yourself." The mention of her father brought tears to Laura's eyes. Douglas Westfield had passed away 6 months ago, a victim of pancreatic cancer, and Brandon had not attended the funeral. He said he had an important meeting in San Francisco he couldn't miss. Laura went alone to bury the only man who had always loved her unconditionally, the man who respected her decision to live anonymously, who never pressured her to take over the company, who only wanted her to be happy. "My father would tell me to move on," Laura replied, wiping the tears with the back of her hand. "And that's exactly what I'm going to do. Are the tickets to Paris still confirmed?" "First class, departing next week. The penthouse in the Marais is ready, and the Sorbonne is waiting for you for art history classes. Your new life is waiting for you, dear." After she hung up, Laura walked through the rooms of the house, touching the surfaces she had polished, the walls she had painted, the spaces she had filled with hope and illusion. Each object told a story of neglect disguised as marriage. The bookshelf, Brandon said, was too intellectual for the living room. The curtains he found too simple for entertaining his clients. The small greenhouse in the garden where she cultivated orchids, which he called a silly hobby for a bored housewife. Patricia Monroe was probably already choosing new furniture, planning elegant parties, imagining herself as the lady of that house. Laura almost felt sorry for her. Patricia didn't know she was getting involved with a man built on foundations that never belonged to him, that her ascent in Seattle society was about to collapse like a house of cards in a gale. In the days that followed, Laura organized her departure with the precision of a general planning a campaign. Each book was carefully packed, each piece of art catalogued and prepared for transport, each important document transferred to Margaret's safe. She donated most of her clothes to charity, keeping only the pieces she truly loved, those she had bought for herself, not to impress Brandon's colleagues. It was during this process of farewell that Laura found the box at the back of Brandon's office closet. She wasn't trying to spy, just looking for documents that might bear her name. Inside the box were letters, dozens of them, all from Patricia. They dated back 3 years, much earlier than Laura had imagined. There were also hotel receipts, photos from trips Brandon said were work conferences, and a receipt from a jewelry store where he had bought an engagement ring for Patricia 6 months ago, while still married, when Laura's father was dying in the hospital. Laura didn't feel anger upon seeing that evidence. She felt relief. Relief at finally having confirmation that her decision was right, that there was nothing there to save, no remnant of love that deserved her loyalty or forgiveness. She methodically photographed everything and sent it to Margaret, not necessarily to use against him, but as security, as proof that the end of that marriage was not her fault. The next morning, Brendan woke up in the presidential suite of the Four Seasons, with Patricia nestled in his arms, the Seattle sun piercing through the silk curtains. He should have been feeling triumphant, free, ready to start his new life. Instead, there was an inexplicable weight on his chest, as if something fundamental had shifted in the balance of the universe. He ignored the feeling, attributing it to lingering guilt that would soon pass. After all, he had made the right choice. Patricia was everything Laura never was: ambitious, sophisticated, a partner who complimented his professional ascent instead of just observing it from the kitchen. Patricia stirred beside him, opening the green eyes that had seduced him 3 years ago during a conference in Vancouver. She smiled, running her fingers across his chest with possessive familiarity. "Finally free," she murmured, her voice husky with sleep. "When can we start moving to Medina? I'm eager to redecorate that house. Laura's style was always so provincial." Brandon chuckled, kissing her forehead. "I've already called the decorators. I want everything ready in a month. Nothing in that house can remind me of my previous life." He paused, feeling that strange tightening again. It was too easy, you know? Laura didn't even argue. She just signed. Patricia got up, wrapping herself in a white silk robe. Why would she argue? She has nothing, Brandon. You built everything yourself. The Queen Anne house must have been the only thing of value she brought into the marriage, and even that was modest. She looked at herself in the mirror, adjusting her perfectly cut blonde hair. You did her a favor. Now she can find someone on her level, someone content with a simple life. Patricia's words should have reassured him, but they didn't. Brandon thought of Laura's expression when she signed the papers, that unnatural calm, as if she were signing a business contract instead of the end of 7 years of marriage. She didn't cry, didn't plead, didn't make a scene. She just picked up the pen he had brought, that Mont Blanc Patricia had given him as a gift, and signed her name with an elegant handwriting he had never noticed before. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Marcus, his best friend and colleague at Fletcher & Associates. "Brandon, man, we need to talk. Urgent." Marcus's voice was tense, without his usual relaxed tone. "What's wrong? Any issues with the Meridian account?" "It's not about work, or rather, it is and it isn't." Marcus paused meaningfully. "Are you home? I need to see you in person." Brandon frowned. "I'm at the Four Seasons. I can meet you at the Pike Starbucks in an hour." When he hung up, Patricia was watching him with curiosity. "Problems?" "I don't know." Marcus seemed odd. He started to get dressed, choosing an Italian blue shirt and tailor-made grey trousers. "He probably wants to discuss the promotion I'm expecting. With my stake in the company increasing, it makes sense for them to offer me a partner position." Patricia smiled, approaching to adjust his tie. "That's exactly what you deserve. We deserve it. We'll finally be the couple we were always meant to be, without that pale shadow holding you back." Brandon drove to Pike Place Market, parking near the coffee shop where he had arranged to meet Marcus. The day was typical Seattle, overcast but without rain, with tourists already gathering around the fishmongers and flower stalls. He vaguely remembered that Laura used to come there every week to buy white lilies, saying they brought light into the house. Small details like this began to surface in his memory, fragments of a life he had discarded without much thought. Marcus was already sitting at a corner table, 2 cups of coffee in front of him. He looked haggard, his eyes red as if he hadn't slept. When he saw Brandon, he made a solemn gesture for him to sit down. "You're going to want to be sitting down for this," Marcus began, pushing a plain brown envelope across the table. "I received this last night, delivered by a private messenger. It's addressed to me as your friend, not as your colleague." Brandon picked up the envelope, feeling the weight of multiple documents inside. "What are you talking about?" "Open it." With fingers that began to tremble without him understanding why, Brandon opened the envelope. Inside were legal documents, bank statements, property deeds, and a handwritten letter. He started to read, and the world around him seemed to slow down, each word piercing his reality like precise bullets. The Queen Anne house was never Laura's in the way he imagined. It was owned by an LLC named Westfield Holdings. The mansion in Medina, where he planned to move with Patricia, was also owned by the same company. The money he had used to buy shares in Fletcher & Associates. The $200,000, Laura said, was her grandmother's inheritance, came from an account managed by that same LLC, and the shares he had bought 3 years ago, which represented 15% of the company, had technically been bought in the name of the LLC, not his own. "This doesn't make sense," Brandon mumbled, flipping through the papers frantically. "Laura never had money. She worked at a gallery when we met." "She was. She's just a housewife." Marcus took a long sip of his coffee, avoiding Brandon's gaze. "There's more. I did some digging last night because I couldn't believe it. Brandon, do you know who Douglas Westfield is?" The name sounded vaguely familiar, like something he should know but couldn't place. "No, should I?" Westfield Pharmaceuticals, one of the largest pharmaceutical conglomerates in the world. Douglas Westfield was its CEO and founder. He died 6 months ago. Marcus paused, letting the information sink in. From pancreatic cancer. Remember when you went to San Francisco for that presentation last November? Brandon felt his blood run cold. November. Laura had asked him to accompany her to a family engagement, said it was important. He had refused, saying his work couldn't wait, that she needed to understand that sacrifices were necessary for success. She didn't insist, just nodded with that neutral expression he had interpreted as submission. That was his funeral, Marcus continued, his voice laden with something between pity and disbelief. The funeral was in all the financial papers. CEOs from half the Fortune 500 companies were present, and Douglas Westfield's only heiress, his daughter Laura Westfield, was there alone. The handwritten letter slipped from Brandon's fingers, falling onto the table. It was from Margaret Chen, a Manhattan lawyer whose firm represented some of America's wealthiest families. She explained, in impeccable legal terms, that all the properties and investments Brandon had assumed were his were, in fact, belonging to her client, Laura Westfield. The newly finalized divorce triggered specific clauses in the contracts he had signed over the years, contracts he had never carefully read because he trusted that Laura didn't understand finances. I need to talk to her. Brandon stood up abruptly, knocking over his cup. Coffee spilled across the table like a dark, accusing stain. This is a mistake. It has to be a mistake. Brandon, Marcus grabbed his arm. Man, she planned this, all of it. Every investment you made, every property you thought was yours, was being funded by her through legal structures you never understood. And now that you're divorced, the post-nuptial clauses you signed, the ones you said were just formalities. I never read those clauses. The admission came out as a devastated whisper. I told the lawyer to handle it. Laura seemed so harmless. Why would I waste time reading pages of legal terms? Marcus released his arm, sinking back into his chair. Because that harmless woman was a billionaire, Brandon, and you treated her as if she was worth nothing. Reality began to penetrate Brandon's carefully constructed defenses. Memories began to rearrange themselves in a new light. Laura speaking 3 languages fluently during a trip to Paris that he assumed were amateur lessons. Laura discussing philosophy with a professor at a dinner party, demonstrating knowledge he attributed to casual readings. Laura writing generous checks to charities, which he thought were her pathetic attempts to feel important. Where is she now? Brandon asked, his voice coming out strangled. According to the letter, leaving Seattle within a week, heading for a new life in Paris. Marcus looked at his friend with an expression that mixed compassion and judgment. You've lost everything, man. The house, the shares, even the Medina mansion has an eviction order, effective in 30 days. And Patricia. What about Patricia? She knew, Brandon. Some of these documents show she did a background check on Laura 2 years ago. She knew exactly who your wife was and didn't tell you. Marcus's revelation echoed in the space between them like a silent cannon shot. Patricia knew. For 2 years of their secret relationship, while he confided his divorce plans, his frustrations with the simple wife who didn't understand his ambitions, Patricia was aware that Laura was one of the wealthiest women in America, and she said nothing. Brandon felt his legs give way. He leaned on the table, his white-knuckled fingers gripping the wood as if it were the only solid thing in a world that suddenly made no sense. Tourists passed around them in the market, laughing and taking photos, oblivious to the personal collapse unfolding at that corner table. A flower vendor passed by, offering white lilies, and Brandon had to look away. The memory of Laura arranging those flowers around the house, now laden with meanings he had been too blind to perceive. Why would she do that? The words came out in a harsh whisper. Why would Patricia hide something so important from me? Marcus ran a hand over his face, looking older than his 34 years. Think about it, Brandon. If you'd known Laura was a billionaire, would you have divorced her? Or would you have tried to make that marriage work, not for love, but for the money? He paused, letting the question hang in the air like toxic smoke. Patricia wanted you, and she wanted the lifestyle she believed you'd build together. She probably thought if Laura was so submissive as to hide her fortune, she wouldn't do anything when you filed for divorce. She bet wrong. Brandon picked his phone up with trembling hands and dialed Patricia's number. She answered on the third ring, her voice cheerful and carefree. "Good morning, love. I was thinking we could have dinner at that new restaurant on Capitol Hill tonight. We need to celebrate our new beginning." "You knew?" It wasn't a question. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for seconds that felt like hours. When Patricia finally spoke, her voice had lost that artificial lightness. "What are you talking about?" "Laura, Westfield Pharmaceuticals, the fortune. You knew who she was and you didn't tell me." Each word came out sharp, honed by betrayal. "Why, Patricia, why would you let me divorce her without knowing the truth?" Another silence, and then a sigh. "Because you would have stayed with her for the money, Brandon. And I didn't want to be your second choice for financial reasons. I wanted you free, completely free, choosing to be with me because I was the one you loved." Her voice carried a mix of defiance and guilt. Laura obviously didn't care about money. She lived like an ordinary person for years. Why should that matter? "It matters because I had the right to know." Brandon stood up, ignoring the curious glances of other customers. "It matters because I just found out that everything I thought I had built wasn't mine. The house, the company shares, even the damn mansion where we planned to live together. It was all hers. I have 30 days to vacate a property I thought was mine." "That's impossible." But Patricia's voice wavered, her confidence draining away. "You bought those shares with your own money. I saw the transactions. Money Laura gave me, saying it was family inheritance. Money that technically came from an LLC she controlled." Brandon felt a bitter laugh rise in his throat. "She funded me, Patricia, for years, and I was too busy feeling superior, too busy with you, to realize that every success I celebrated was built on foundations she laid." Marcus watched the phone conversation with a grim expression, stirring his now cold coffee. When Brandon finally hung up, after Patricia tried to argue that they could still make it work, that he could sue Laura, that there were ways to reverse the situation, Marcus pushed another document across the table. "There's one more thing you need to know." His voice was gentle, the way one speaks to someone who has already suffered too much but needs to hear the full truth. "Fletcher and Associates, the shares you bought 3 years ago, the LLC has already exercised its right of repurchase, but there's something bigger. The company was having financial problems 5 years ago, remember, when the old founder was considering closing its doors?" Brandon nodded vaguely, remembering the tense meetings, the rumors of bankruptcy, the fear that permeated the office corridors. An anonymous investor injected enough capital to save the company. No one ever knew who it was. $5 million in exchange for silent equity. Marcus pointed to another document. It was Westfield Holdings. It was Laura. She saved the company where you worked, Brandon. And now, with the divorce finalized and the clauses triggered, she is exercising her right to assume majority control. 60% of Fletcher and Associates now officially belongs to her. The air seemed to be sucked from Brandon's lungs. The room spun, and he had to sit down again, his head in his hands. Each revelation was an additional layer of humiliation, a clear demonstration of how completely he had underestimated the woman with whom he had shared a bed for 7 years. "My job," he began, but couldn't finish the sentence. "Technically, it's still yours for now." Marcus gathered all the documents back into the envelope, But Brandon, she has decision-making power over promotions, salaries, contracts. Everything you built at Fletcher, every client you cultivated, every promotion you earned was under her financial umbrella, and you treated her as if she was invisible. Brandon thought of all the business dinners where he introduced Laura with that condescending smile, when he remembered to introduce her at all. He thought of the times he interrupted her when she tried to contribute to conversations, later saying she didn't understand business. He thought of how he had brought Patricia to the last company dinner, introducing her as his partner, while Laura was at home, alone, probably knowing exactly what was happening. "I need to talk to her," Brandon repeated, but this time with real desperation in his voice. "I need to fix this, Marcus. I need to explain, apologize, make her understand that I didn't know, that if I had known." "What? You would have stayed with her for the money. You would have been faithful. You would have treated her with respect." Marcus shook his head. "Man, you had an incredible woman who loved you enough to live a lie, to hide who she was just to be sure you loved her for herself. And you failed the test, Brandon. You failed spectacularly." The words cut deep because they were true. Brandon remembered small moments that now shone with new meaning. Laura donating $20,000 to a children's charity, and him complaining she was being irresponsible with money. Laura casually mentioning she had met a French minister at an art gallery, and him laughing, thinking she was confused. Laura offering opinions on pharmaceutical investments, and him changing the subject to talk about sports. Assuming she didn't know what she was talking about, she knew, she had always known, and he had been too arrogant, too blind, too cruel to notice. Brandon left the market in a state of shock, driving aimlessly through the streets of Seattle that suddenly seemed strange and hostile. He ended up parking near the Queen Anne house, the house he now knew had never truly been his. From the outside, everything looked normal. The hydrangeas Laura had planted bloomed in the front garden. The red door he once criticized for being too flashy shone under the overcast afternoon light. He no longer had the keys. He realized this when he tried to open the door. Laura had changed the locks. Of course she had. Through the living room window, he could see stacked boxes, the empty spaces where furniture once stood, the physical evidence of a life being dismantled and rebuilt elsewhere. An elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chen from 3 houses down, stopped in her garden when she saw him. She was carrying a grocery bag and wore that look of disapproval that older people perfectly master. "She's already gone, if that's what you're looking for," Mrs. Chen said, her Chinese accent coloring the words. "Laura was a good neighbor, always kind, always helping. When my Henry was sick last year, she brought soup every week, never asked for anything in return." Brandon didn't know what to say. He hadn't known the neighbor had been ill. He hadn't known Laura cooked for other people besides him. There was so much he hadn't known. "Where is she now?" he managed to ask. Mrs. Chen looked at him suspiciously. "Why should I tell you? You're the man who made her cry, hidden in the garden so many nights thinking no one saw. You're the man who brought that other woman onto your street, not even caring who might see." She adjusted the bag on her arm. "Laura deserves better, always has." She walked away, leaving Brandon alone on the sidewalk, in front of the house that represented everything he had lost. His phone vibrated with a message from Patricia asking where he was, saying they needed to talk, that she could explain her choices. He ignored the message. Instead, he drove to the Fletcher and Associates office, the glass building in the financial district where he had spent the last 8 years building his career. The security guard greeted him normally, unaware that the man entering was now an employee of his own ex-wife. Brandon went up to the 14th floor, where his office, with a partial view of the bay, used to make him feel successful. Sitting in his leather chair, surrounded by diplomas and awards that suddenly seemed devoid of meaning, Brandon opened his laptop and typed Laura's full name into search engines. He didn't know why he had never done this before. Laziness, perhaps, or arrogance, the assumption that a housewife wouldn't have anything interesting in her history. The results exploded on the screen. Pages and pages about Douglas Westfield, his pharmaceutical company, his revolutionary advancements in the treatment of rare diseases. And there, in older articles, photos of a younger Laura beside her father at charity events, galas, hospital inaugurations. Laura in gala dresses, smiling politely for cameras, always a step behind her father, clearly uncomfortable with the spotlight. A specific article caught his eye, dated 10 years ago. Westfield heiress leaves family empire to pursue passion for art. The piece described how Laura, then 23, had moved from New York to Seattle, refusing an executive position in the family company to work at a small gallery. Her quote in the article was revealing, "I want to be loved for who I am, not for the name I carry. I want to build real relationships, not transactions disguised as friendship." Brandon closed the laptop, unable to keep reading. Every word was an accusation, every photo a reminder of his monumental blindness. He had had exactly what she was looking for, the chance to love her for who she was, and he had squandered that chance spectacularly. The next 5 days passed in a hazy blur of devastating discoveries and crumbling realities. Brandon cancelled meetings, ignored calls from Patricia, and spent hours navigating through files that documented his own ignorance. Every bank statement, every unread contract, every property he had assumed was the fruit of his hard work, revealed the same humiliating truth. Laura had been the invisible architect of his entire life. The Medina mansion was the first tangible loss. Laura's lawyers were efficient and impersonal, delivering the eviction notice with a professional courtesy that somehow made everything worse. Brandon visited the property one last time, walking through the empty rooms that Patricia had already begun to mentally decorate. Wallpaper samples were scattered across the gourmet kitchen counter. Furniture catalogues marked with pink post-its, plans for a life that would never exist. Patricia had tried to argue that they could still reverse the situation, hire better lawyers, find loopholes in the contracts, but Brandon knew the truth now. There were no loopholes. Laura and her lawyers had built a perfect legal structure, invisible yet impenetrable. Every document he had signed over the years contained clauses he had ignored, confident that his simple wife wouldn't understand complex financial matters. The irony was so bitter he could almost taste it. On Wednesday, he was summoned to a meeting at the office with the senior partners of Fletcher and Associates. The conference room on the 20th floor had a panoramic view of Elliott Bay, but Brandon barely registered the scenery as he sat before Richard Fletcher, the octogenarian founder who rarely appeared at the office, and 2 other partners who avoided his gaze. Richard clasped his hands on the polished mahogany table, his faded blue eyes studying Brandon with an expression that mixed curiosity with something akin to disappointment. "I assume you know why you're here." Brandon nodded, unable to trust his voice. "We've received formal notification that Westfield Holdings has exercised its right to assume majority control of the company. 62% of the shares now belong to Ms. Laura Westfield." Richard paused, letting the name hang in the air. "Your ex-wife, I believe." "I didn't know," Brandon managed to say, the words coming out weak and pathetic. "During our entire marriage, I had no idea who she truly was." One of the other partners, Thomas Brennan, let out a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. "That became quite clear, Brandon. Ms. Westfield saved this company 5 years ago when we were on the brink of bankruptcy. She invested $5 million without demanding anything more than a silent stake. We knew who she was. We always knew." The revelation hit Brandon like a physical blow. "You knew. All these years, you knew my wife was the anonymous investor. She requested discretion. She said she wanted you to build your career on your own merit, without the shadow of her connections." Richard leaned forward, his voice laced with a gentleness that somehow stung more than open judgment. Laura Westfield is one of the most intelligent and compassionate women I've ever met. She attended all board meetings via video conference, always with her camera off, offering insights that saved this company more times than I can count, and you never suspected. Brandon thought of all the times Laura had asked about his day, about his projects, about the challenges the company faced. He always responded vaguely, assuming she wouldn't understand the details, that she was just making polite wife talk. She wasn't making polite talk. She was monitoring her own investment, tracking the health of the company she secretly owned. "My job," Brandon began, but didn't know how to finish the question. "It remains intact, for now." Thomas exchanged a look with Richard. "Ms. Westfield was specific in her instructions. She doesn't want revenge, just distance. You will retain your current position, your salary remains the same, but any career advancement is effectively frozen. She also requested that you not try to contact her through professional channels." "I need to talk to her," Brandon insisted, hearing the desperation in his own voice and hating himself for it. "I need to explain, to apologize. I need her to know that I didn't know, that if I had known—" "What?" Richard interrupted him, his voice losing its previous gentleness. "You would have been faithful. Would you have treated your wife with the basic respect any human being deserves? Brandon, you brought your mistress to company events. You introduced Patricia Monroe as your partner while you were still married. Half of Seattle knew about your affair before Laura signed the divorce papers." Shame flooded Brandon, hot and suffocating. He'd been so careless, so arrogant in his certainty that Laura was just a housewife with no connections or resources of her own. Meanwhile, she was sitting in board meetings directing the future of the company that employed him, keeping her identity hidden, protecting his ego even when he deserved no protection at all. "When does she leave?" Brandon asked, his voice little more than a whisper. "Tomorrow. Flight to Paris at 3 in the afternoon." Richard gathered the papers in front of him with precise movements. "And Brandon, if I were you, I'd let her go. You had 7 years to get to know the woman you married. You chose not to see. Don't torture her now with pleas for forgiveness that you both know you don't deserve." Brandon left the office in a trance, Richard's words echoing in his mind like an accusatory mantra. He passed Marcus's cubicle, who watched him with a mix of pity and disapproval that Brandon was beginning to recognize in every face around him. The story had spread through the office with the speed of a wildfire. Everyone knew now. Everyone knew he had been married to Laura Westfield and treated her as if she were invisible. His phone rang as he waited for the elevator. Patricia. He considered ignoring it, but answered at the last moment, part of him still seeking some kind of normalcy in a world that had turned upside down. "We need to talk. In person." Her voice was tense, stripped of the seductive confidence that had always characterized her. "I'm at the apartment. My apartment. Can you come?" Brandon drove to Capitol Hill, where Patricia kept a modern loft overlooking the city center. She opened the door before he could knock, dressed casually in jeans and a silk blouse, her face free of her usual makeup. She seemed smaller like this, more vulnerable. And for the first time, Brandon wondered who Patricia Monroe was behind the carefully constructed persona. "I lost my job," she said without preamble, closing the door behind him. "The firm fired me this morning. Conflict of interest, they said. Apparently, one of the firm's main clients has ties to Westfield Pharmaceuticals, and my relationship with you became a problem." Brandon watched her walk to the window, her movements tense and controlled. Part of him expected to feel compassion, but all he found was a numb void. "You knew who she was," he said, a statement, not a question. 2 years, Patricia. For 2 years you knew Laura was a billionaire, and you didn't tell me." She turned to face him, and for the first time since they met, Brandon saw something real in her eyes, fear. "I thought you'd choose the money, that you'd stay with her if you knew. And I wanted you, Brandon. I wanted you so much that I made that decision for you. You had no right." The anger he had contained for days began to boil over. "You let me destroy my marriage, destroy my life, based on a lie. You made me look like a fool, Patricia. An arrogant fool who didn't know his own wife was the reason for every success he celebrated." "And you would have stayed with her," Patricia cried, her composure finally breaking. "Admit it, Brandon. If you knew Laura was worth billions, that she controlled the company where you worked, you would have swallowed your pride and stayed married. Not for love, for the money, for the security, for the connections. At least this way you chose me for me." The truth in her words cut deeper than any lie could. Brandon found himself speechless, because she was right. If he had known about Laura's fortune, would he really have gotten divorced? Or would he have tried to make the marriage work, not out of love, but out of greed disguised as commitment? The answer sickened him. "We're over," he said, the words coming out softer than he expected. "Whatever we had, Patricia, was built on deceptions, mine and yours. There's no moving forward from this." She didn't argue. She just nodded, tears finally escaping her carefully maintained defenses. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know." Brandon turned towards the door, pausing with his hand on the doorknob. "But it doesn't include you, and it probably doesn't include Seattle, not after all this." He left, leaving Patricia alone in her loft with a prime view of a city that suddenly seemed too small to contain the magnitude of his mistakes. The afternoon had given way to twilight, the sky over Puget Sound painted in shades of orange and purple that Laura would have loved. She always stopped what she was doing to admire the sunset, calling him to see, pointing out the colors and how they changed with each passing moment. He rarely stopped. He always had something more important to do, some email to answer, some call to make. Brandon drove aimlessly, ending up in Discovery Park, where he had proposed to Laura 6 years ago. The park was almost empty in the fading light, only a few night joggers and dog walkers sharing the trails. He found the exact spot near the lighthouse where he had knelt and offered a ring that he now realized had been ridiculously modest for a billionaire. Laura had cried, saying yes between happy sobs, kissing him as if he had offered her the world. She didn't care about the ring. She never cared about money, about mansions, about luxury cars or expensive jewelry. She wanted to be loved for who she was, not for what she possessed. And he had failed that test in the most spectacular way possible, not because he chose her money, but because he despised her through his neglect. Sitting on a weather-beaten wooden bench, Brandon finally allowed the full reality to hit him. Not just what he had lost in material terms, but what he had squandered in human terms. Laura wasn't perfect, he supposed. No one was. But she had been genuine in her love, patient in her waiting to be seen, generous even in the face of his constant neglect. And he had repaid that generosity with betrayal, scorn, and abandonment. The phone in his pocket seemed to weigh a ton. He knew he had her cell number, but he also knew she had probably already blocked him. Even so, his fingers found the device, opening old conversations, reading messages that now carried new meanings. Small things he had ignored at the time. Laura saying she loved watching him pursue his dreams, asking if he needed anything, offering support that he always dismissed as unnecessary interference. Her last message was 3 weeks ago, before everything fell apart. "I'm proud of you, Brandon. No matter what happens, I want you to know that." He had responded with a thumbs-up emoji, too busy in a meeting to write real words. She was saying goodbye, he realized now, offering a final kindness before closing that chapter of her life. The sleepless night left Brandon with red eyes and a painful clarity that only comes when there's nothing left to lose. He had spent the hours in the gloom of his hotel room because he no longer had a home to return to, revisiting every moment of the last 7 years through a lens that finally saw clearly. Every memory was an accusation. Every ignored gesture from Laura now shone as evidence of a love he never deserved. Dawn over Seattle arrived veiled in mist, as if the city itself were ashamed for him. Brandon showered mechanically, put on a suit that Patricia had chosen for him months ago, and grabbed the keys to a car he would soon have to return, as the financing had been approved using Laura as a co-signer. Yet another revelation his lawyers had shared with sadistic pleasure. Even the vehicle he drove was technically hers. Marcus called at 8 in the morning, his hesitant voice breaking through the silence of the room. "Man, I know it's probably the last thing you want to hear, but I need to tell you before you find out another way. The story leaked to the media. Not all the details, but enough. Executive discovers ex-wife is billionaire pharmaceutical heiress. It's on all the local news sites." Brandon closed his eyes, leaning against the wall. Of course it leaked. Seattle was a big city, but his social circle was a tiny fishbowl where secrets lasted less than cut flowers. Let it be, it doesn't matter anymore. "Are you still going to try to talk to her at the airport?" Marcus paused significantly, "Because if you are, you need to know there will probably be photographers. The departure of the Westfield heiress after a scandalous divorce, it's easy headline fodder." The idea of turning their last meeting into a public spectacle made Brandon's stomach churn, but he had no choice. There was no other way to reach Laura, no other opportunity than to intercept her before she embarked on a life where he would be just an unpleasant footnote. "I have to do this, Marcus. Not to change anything, just so she knows that I finally see." After hanging up, Brandon spent the following hours in a state of suspension, watching the clock advance with methodical cruelty towards 3 in the afternoon. He tried to rehearse what he would say, but all the words sounded empty, insufficient to carry the weight of what he needed to communicate. How do you summarize 7 years of blindness in an airport speech? How do you ask for forgiveness for having squandered someone's genuine love while pursuing a chrome illusion? At 2 o'clock, he drove to SeaTac International Airport, the afternoon traffic conspiring to turn every minute into an anxious eternity. The airport was typically chaotic, travelers moving in human streams through the terminals, screens announcing departures and arrivals in a language that seemed alien to his fragmented mental state. Brandon parked on the upper deck, his hands trembling as he turned off the engine. Marcus was right about the photographers. He spotted them immediately, 3 men with professional cameras positioned strategically near the entrance to the international terminal. They hadn't recognized him yet, their gazes sweeping the crowd in search of Laura. Brandon felt bile rising in his throat at the thought of those lenses capturing his most vulnerable moment, turning his personal ruin into entertainment for people's morning consumption. He almost gave up right there. Almost went back to the car, drove anywhere but that terminal, let Laura leave with her dignity intact. But then he saw Margaret Chen stepping out of a black sedan, elegant in her dark grey suit, carrying a leather briefcase that probably contained documents important enough to buy small cities. And behind her, stepping out of the same vehicle with the quiet grace that always characterized her, was Laura. The impact of seeing her stole the air from Brandon's lungs. She was different, but it took him a moment to identify exactly how. The brown hair she always kept in a simple bun now fell in loose waves over her shoulders. She wore a grey wool coat over a simple but perfectly tailored black dress, moderate heels, a discreet handbag. Nothing ostentatious, nothing that screamed wealth. But there was an indefinable quality in her appearance that spoke of someone finally comfortable in her own skin. The photographers moved like predators, sensing movement, cameras raised, but Margaret positioned herself strategically between them and Laura, her body language clearly communicating that any approach would be unwelcome. An airport security guard also appeared, clearly hired specifically for this situation, creating a polite but firm barrier between the Westfield heiress and the opportunistic media. Brandon began to move towards her before his conscious brain made the decision. His feet carried him across the parking lot, through the automatic doors, through the crowd of oblivious travelers, until he was only 15 meters away. Margaret saw him first, her eyes narrowing with recognition and something akin to a warning. She touched Laura's arm, whispering something, and then Laura turned. Their eyes met across the chaos of the airport, and Brandon saw something pass across her face, too quick to definitively categorize. Surprise, perhaps, or resignation, definitely not hope. And the absence of that specific emotion cut deeper than he anticipated. Laura said something to Margaret, who clearly disagreed. But after a brief exchange, the lawyer stepped back a few paces, staying close enough to intervene if necessary. Brandon closed the distance between them, vaguely conscious of the camera flashes capturing every step, every moment of this public humiliation. When he was only a meter from Laura, so close he could see the small details he had always loved without realizing he loved them, his legs simply gave out. He hadn't planned it, hadn't rehearsed it, but suddenly he was on his knees on the cold airport floor, looking up at the woman he had treated as invisible for 7 years. Laura! His voice came out hoarse, broken. Please, just give me 5 minutes. She watched him from that position, her face a mask of careful composure he now recognized as a defense mechanism, not natural coldness. Around them, travelers began to notice the scene, some stopping to observe, others pretending not to see as they quickened their pace. The photographers were having a field day, their cameras clicking like hungry metallic insects. "Get up, Brandon!" Her first words in a week were soft, but carried an authority he had never noticed before. "You're making a scene. I don't care." And he really didn't care. All the arrogance, all the concern for appearances that had defined his last years evaporated before the reality of losing her permanently. "I need you to know. I need you to understand that I know now. I know who you are, who you always were, and I'm so sorry, I'm so very sorry, Laura." She closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again, there was something akin to pain there. "You're sorry because you found out I have money, because you realized what you lost in material terms. It's not about me, Brandon, it never was." "No." He shook his head vehemently, conscious of how desperate he must look, on his knees on the airport floor, like a medieval supplicant. "It's not about the money. I don't want your money, Laura. I just want you to know that I finally see. You watered plants every morning because you believed in cultivating beautiful things. You cooked soup for sick neighbors I didn't even know existed. You bought white lilies every week because they brought light into our home. You tried to share your opinions, your intelligence, your heart, and I was too busy feeling superior to realize you were the most extraordinary person I had ever met." Tears glistened in her eyes but didn't fall. "You're 7 years too late, Brandon. 7 years of me waiting to be seen, to be heard, to matter to the man who swore to love me. And when you finally see me, it's only because the curtain was torn away, not because you chose to look." The words were true and unforgiving, and Brandon accepted them as just punishment. "I know. Believe me, I know. I'm not asking for another chance. I don't deserve another chance. I just need you to know before you leave that the mistake was mine. Completely mine. You were incredible, generous, patient beyond any reasonable measure, and I squandered it because I was blinded by my own arrogance." Margaret approached, gently touching Laura's shoulder. "We need to check in, dear. The flight won't wait." Laura nodded but didn't take her eyes off Brandon. "Get up, please. Don't make this harder than it already is." He rose slowly, his legs protesting, his pride long abandoned on the cold floor where he had knelt. Standing, he realized how different she looked when viewed eye to eye, not from above with ill-disguised condescension. She had always been beautiful, but now there was a strength in her that made her radiant, as if letting go of the mask of the submissive housewife had released something fundamental that had always been there. "I hope," Brandon said, choosing his last words carefully because he knew they would be the last he exchanged with her, "that Paris gives you everything you deserve, that you find someone who sees you immediately, who values every word, every opinion, every moment. That you are incredibly happy, Laura. You deserve all the happiness in the world." A single tear finally escaped, tracing a solitary path down her cheek. "Goodbye, Brandon." She turned, Margaret at her side, the security guard making her way through the curious crowd. Brandon stood still, watching her walk away, her figure growing smaller as she moved towards security, then the gate, then a life where he would be just an unpleasant memory. The photographers were still taking pictures, but he barely registered them. All he saw was Laura, walking towards Paris, towards freedom, towards everything he had been too arrogant to offer her. When she disappeared from sight, Brandon finally moved, his feet carrying him back through the terminal, back to the parking lot, back to the car that wasn't really his. He sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine, his hands on the steering wheel, the airport continuing its chaotic routine around him as if his world hadn't just completely crumbled. His phone vibrated with a message from Marcus. "Saw the photos online. Are you okay?" Brandon typed a reply, then deleted it. Typed another, deleted it again. Finally he wrote, "No, but I'll be okay." It was a lie, of course. He wasn't okay and wasn't sure he ever would be. But perhaps with enough time, with enough distance, with enough work on becoming a better person, he could learn to live with the weight of having had everything and thrown it away. For now, all he could do was sit in that car in an airport parking lot and accept that some mistakes have no redemption. Some loves, once lost, remain lost. And Laura Westfield, flying towards Paris and a newly started life, was one of them. Air France Flight 342 bound for Paris departed punctually at 3:15 in the afternoon, carrying Laura Westfield away from Seattle and a life that had become too small to contain her. Brandon remained in the airport parking lot until the twilight began to paint the sky, unable to move, as if leaving that place meant finally accepting that she was gone forever. His phone vibrated constantly with messages, missed calls from Patricia, from Marcus, from unknown numbers that were likely journalists wanting a statement about the man who had publicly knelt before his billionaire ex-wife. He ignored them all. When he finally started the car and left the airport, Brandon had no destination in mind. The hotel room downtown offered no comfort, just impersonal walls that reflected the emptiness he felt inside. Instead, he drove through the familiar streets of Seattle, passing landmarks that now carried memories revised by the truth. The art gallery in Pike Place Market where Laura had worked when they first met wasn't just a casual job, he realized now. It was her attempt to live anonymously, to build an identity separate from the Westfield empire. And he, in his ignorant arrogance, had found it charming that she worked in such a modest place, as if it were a lovely hobby instead of a conscious choice. Photos of the airport scene were already circulating on social media when Brandon finally checked his phone that night. Himself on his knees, his face contorted in despair, Laura looking down with an expression that commentators interpreted in 1,000 different ways. Some called him pathetic, others romantic. The truth, he knew, lay somewhere between these extremes. He was a man confronting the consequences of years of calculated neglect, and no amount of public regret could undo the damage. Marcus showed up at the hotel the next morning uninvited, carrying coffee and bagels that Brandon had no appetite for. His friend sat in the room's only chair, watching Brandon with the silent concern of someone who had witnessed a slow-motion disaster and couldn't stop it. "You need to make some decisions," Marcus said finally, pushing the coffee towards Brandon. "The firm wants to know if you're taking a leave of absence, if you're continuing to work, what your plans are. And there's the matter of the house in Queen Anne. Laura's lawyers sent formal notification. You have 2 weeks to remove your personal belongings before it's put up for sale." Brandon held the coffee without drinking it, the warmth penetrating his numb palms. "I don't have many personal belongings. Most of the things were hers, I realize now. The books, the art on the walls, even the furniture I thought we had chosen together. She chose everything, and I just absent-mindedly nodded while checking emails. There are your clothes, documents, golf equipment." Marcus paused. "And we need to talk about Patricia." The name produced a visceral reaction in Brandon, a mixture of anger and shame that soured in his stomach. "There's nothing to talk about with Patricia. We're over. She knew who Laura was, and let me destroy my marriage based on that lie. There's no forgiveness for that." "She's giving interviews," Marcus said softly, as if delivering bad news to a terminal patient. "Saying you used her, that you promised to leave Laura for her, that she's as much a victim as Laura was. Narratives are forming, Brandon, and you need to decide if you're going to tell your side or let others define who you are." Brandon finally took a sip of the coffee, the bitterness perfectly matching his mood. "Let her talk. Let everyone talk. The truth is, I was a terrible husband who couldn't see the value of the person I married. Patricia is guilty of omission, but I am guilty of something much worse. I chose not to see. Every day, for 7 years, I chose to treat Laura as if she were invisible. That's my story, Marcus. There's no way to sugarcoat that." In the following days, Brandon fell into a mechanical routine of survival. Work, although every moment in the Fletcher and Associates office was permeated by the knowledge that Laura now owned the company. He avoided the cafeteria where colleagues whispered when he passed, avoided the social gatherings he used to attend with Patricia on his arm. His world had shrunk to a small, manageable space where the humiliation was less acute. Margaret Chen called unexpectedly on a cloudy Thursday, her voice professional but not hostile. "Mr. Hayes, I'm calling on behalf of my client to discuss some pending matters related to the divorce." Brandon straightened in his office chair, his heart quickening at the indirect mention of Laura. "Of course. What needs to be resolved?" "The property in Queen Anne. Laura would like to offer you the opportunity to buy the house at fair market value, if you're interested. She is aware that you contributed to improvements on the property over the years and wants to be fair." Margaret paused. "There's also the matter of your personal investments in Fletcher and Associates. Although the original shares revert to Laura as agreed, she is willing to offer compensation for the years you worked, believing they were yours." The generosity was like salt in open wounds. "Why is she doing this? I don't deserve her consideration, much less financial generosity." "My client is not interested in revenge, Mr. Hayes. She simply wants to close this chapter of her life and move on." Margaret's voice softened minimally. "Laura has always been this way. Even when she would have justification for cruelty, she chooses dignity. It's one of the qualities that make her so extraordinary." Brandon swallowed the lump in his throat. "Tell her I don't want anything. The house, the shares, any compensation. She can do whatever she wants with everything. I just want her to know I'm sorry, more than words can express." "I will relay your message." Margaret hesitated, and for the first time, her professional armor seemed to crack slightly. "For what it's worth, Mr. Hayes, Laura is doing well. She started classes at the Sorbonne. She's living in a beautiful neighborhood in Paris, reconnecting with old friends. She's building the life she always wanted. I thought you'd want to know." After he hung up, Brandon allowed himself to imagine Laura in Paris, walking down the cobblestone streets she had always wanted to explore, sitting in cafes, reading French books she read fluently but he had never known, visiting museums and galleries where she could finally discuss art without being dismissed as a housewife with pretensions. The image should have comforted him, knowing she was happy, but it only intensified the emptiness where something he had mistaken for contentment used to exist. The sale of the house in Queen Anne was finalized 6 weeks after Laura left. Brandon attended one last time to collect the few things that were indisputably his, mainly clothes and some sports equipment. The new owner, a retired doctor named Dr. Sharma, was overseeing renovations when he arrived, polite but clearly aware of who he was and the scandal that had surrounded the property. "Laura was much loved in this neighborhood," Dr. Sharma commented as Brandon packed boxes in the old bedroom. "My daughter had leukemia 3 years ago. Laura found out, I don't know how, and anonymously paid for experimental treatments our insurance didn't cover. It saved Priya's life. I only found out it was Laura when I bought this house and the neighbors told me." She looked at Brandon with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. "People like her are rare. I hope to do justice to the home she loved so much." Each revelation about Laura was a fresh wound. How many other lives had she quietly touched while Brandon was busy ignoring her? How many anonymous acts of generosity had she performed while he complained she gave too much to charity? He began to see ghosts of her in every corner of the house. Not the submissive Laura he had constructed in his mind, but the true Laura, the woman of extraordinary strength and boundless compassion who chose to live small to test if she could be loved for herself. She had been loved, he realized now, by neighbors like Mrs. Chen and Dr. Sharma, by people in the community she helped without seeking recognition, by staff at the gallery where she worked, and her father's colleagues who respected her choices even when they didn't understand them. Everyone loved her. Only her own husband had failed that basic test of humanity. Autumn arrived in Seattle, with its characteristic mix of rain and melancholy. Brandon continued working at Fletcher & Associates, but any ambition that once propelled him had evaporated. He completed projects competently, but without passion, attended meetings, but rarely contributed beyond what was necessary. Marcus, promoted to junior partner in August, tried to pull him back into engagement, but both knew that Brandon's heart wasn't in it anymore. Patricia had moved to Portland, accepting a position at a smaller firm after her reputation in Seattle became too toxic to recover from. She tried to contact him a few times in the first weeks, messages vacillating between defensive anger and something akin to genuine regret, but Brandon never responded. That relationship, built on mutual deception and empty ambition, seemed to belong to someone else in another life. On a rainy October afternoon, Brandon received an envelope via certified mail. Inside were documents finalizing all outstanding divorce matters, along with a handwritten letter on high-quality cream stationery. He recognized the handwriting immediately, that same elegance that had signed the divorce papers months ago. "Brandon," the letter began, without warm greetings or artificiality. "Margaret told me you refused any financial compensation related to our separation. While I appreciate the gesture, I cannot in good conscience leave you with nothing after 7 years. I've transferred $200,000 to an account in your name. It's what you originally invested in Fletcher, coming from the fund I told you was my grandmother's inheritance. Technically, it was always your money, just filtered through me. Use it as you wish." Brandon paused in his reading, his eyes stinging. Even now, even after everything, she was being fair beyond what he deserved. The letter continued. I'm not writing to you seeking reconciliation or to ease your conscience. I'm writing because I spent 7 years not speaking truths that needed to be said, and I don't want to carry that any longer. You hurt me, Brandon, deeply. But I also chose to stay, chose to hide who I was, chose to accept less than I deserved because I was afraid to be alone. We both failed in that marriage, just in different ways. Paris is healing me. I'm doing therapy, something I should have started years ago. I'm learning to value my own voice, to take up space without apologizing, not to hide who I am for fear of rejection. I'm learning that real love doesn't require me to diminish myself. I hope you are also learning and growing, not for me, but for yourself and for who you become in the future. The letter ended simply, I forgive you, Brandon. Not because you asked, but because I need to release this anger to move forward. I hope one day you can forgive yourself. Take care, Laura. Brandon read the letter 3 times, then a 4th, memorizing every word. The forgiveness should have brought relief, but it only intensified the weight of loss. He had been forgiven by someone he hadn't been able to forgive himself, released by someone he still held on to in every thought, every memory, every regret that painted his sleepless nights. He filed the letter in his desk drawer, along with the only photo he had kept of them together, taken at their wedding 6 years ago. Laura smiled in that photo, genuinely happy, still believing she had found a love that would value who she truly was. Brandon, in a rented suit and confident smile, looked like a stranger now. That man had believed he had won the lottery of life, marrying a beautiful, compliant woman who would never challenge him. He had no idea he had actually won the lottery, only to throw the winning ticket in the trash without ever checking the numbers. The months transformed Seattle into a different city in Brandon's eyes. Or perhaps he had become a different observer. Winter arrived with its characteristic 4 o'clock darkness, constant rain that washed the streets but never seemed to completely cleanse the melancholy that had settled in his bones. He had moved into a small apartment in Fremont, a studio overlooking the ship canal that cost 1/3 of what the mansion in Medina would have cost. But that felt more honest, more fitting for who he truly was, without the illusions Laura had gently maintained. The money she had transferred remained untouched in his bank account, $200,000 that Brandon couldn't bring himself to spend. It wasn't pride exactly, but something closer to self-imposed penance. Using that money seemed to trivialize what he had lost, to reduce years of marital failure to a financial transaction that could be settled with a generous check. So the money stayed there, accruing insignificant interest, a constant reminder that even his attempt to refuse compensation had been gently overridden by the woman who knew better than he did what was fair. Marcus continued to be his only real connection to the world, showing up regularly with beer and well-intentioned attempts to draw him out of self-destructive isolation. On one particularly cold December night, he arrived at the apartment carrying pizza and news that clearly made him uncomfortable. "There's something you need to know," Marcus began, avoiding eye contact as he dealt out slices onto paper plates. "Laura's back in Seattle, temporarily. There's a charity gala next week, something related to Westfield Pharmaceuticals donating to childhood cancer research. She's going to be there." Brandon felt his heart quicken in a way he thought he had forgotten. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because Fletcher & Associates is one of the corporate sponsors. The firm bought a table, and as a partner, technically I'm obliged to attend." Marcus finally met his gaze. "I thought you'd want a heads up in case you decide to avoid downtown that night." The idea of being at the same event as Laura, even in the same zip code, sent contradictory waves through Brandon. Part of him, the masochistic part that had defined the past few months, wanted to be there, to see her again, to confirm she really was well, as Margaret had said. The more rational part, the small sliver of self-preservation he still possessed, knew that seeing her would reopen wounds that had barely begun to form fragile scabs. "I won't go," Brandon said finally, biting into the pizza without really tasting it. "She doesn't need to see me, and I definitely have no right to intrude on her space." Marcus nodded, clearly relieved. Probably the right call, though. He hesitated. "The rumors say she's bringing someone. A Sorbonne professor or something. Just thought you should be prepared to see pictures online." The information should have caused jealousy, Brandon knew that. It should have triggered that sharp pang of wounded possessiveness. Instead, all he felt was a heavy sadness and something surprisingly close to relief. Laura was moving on, building a new life with someone who presumably valued her from the very first moment. It was exactly what she deserved, exactly what he had destroyed their marriage to deny her. But Marcus's words echoed in his mind for the following days, planting seeds of something Brandon couldn't quite name. It wasn't hope, because he had no illusions about reconciliation. Perhaps it was a need for closure, or simply the masochistic desire to see with his own eyes that she was genuinely happy, that her forgiveness in the letter had been real and not just pretty words to facilitate her own healing. On the night of the gala, Brandon found himself unable to stay in the apartment. He drove with no real destination, ending up inexplicably downtown, parking 3 blocks from the hotel where the event was happening. He didn't plan to go in, he told himself. He just wanted to be close, as if physical proximity to Laura could somehow convey all the words his letter had left unsaid. The Fairmont Olympic Hotel shone with lights and movement, expensive cars discharging passengers in formal wear at the decorated entrance. Brandon watched from his position on the opposite sidewalk, hands in his coat pockets, trying to convince himself to leave. That's when he saw her, stepping out of a black sedan, and the whole world seemed to pause. Laura wore an emerald green dress that hugged her body in ways her casual clothes never revealed. Her hair pulled into an elegant chignon that left her neck exposed, diamond earrings catching the light. But it wasn't the physical appearance that stole the air from Brandon's lungs. It was the way she moved, with a confidence she had never displayed during their marriage, smiling openly at someone stepping out of the car behind her, a man with glasses and graying hair who offered his arm with gentle familiarity. They looked good together. Brandon observed with a pang that was pain, but also something akin to peace. The man looked at Laura as if she were precious, listening intently when she said something, responding in a way that made her laugh genuinely. It was the way Brandon should have looked at her for 7 years and never had. He should have left then. He should have gone back to the car and driven to the apartment, grateful to have seen she was well, and let that chapter finally close. Instead, his feet betrayed him, carrying him across the street, closer to the entrance where guests still arrived in waves of silk and tuxedos. That's when Laura saw him. Her eyes met his across the elegant crowd, and something indefinable crossed her expression. Surprise, certainly, perhaps something akin to concern. The man beside her followed her gaze, frowning slightly at the sight of Brandon, standing there like an inconvenient ghost of relationships past. Laura said something to her companion, who nodded reluctantly, then began walking towards Brandon. Every step she took was measured, deliberate, and he stood paralyzed, unable to flee or advance, caught between contradictory impulses that had defined his existence since she left. Brandon. Her voice was soft when she came close enough to speak without shouting. "What are you doing here?" He had no prepared answer, no explanation that wouldn't make him sound pathetic or obsessive. "I don't know. Marcus mentioned the event, and I tried to stay away, but—" He gestured helplessly. "Apparently I couldn't." Laura studied his face, with those brown eyes he had looked through for years without truly seeing. "Did you get my letter? I read it 100 times, maybe 1,000. Brandon forced himself to meet her gaze. "You forgave me, Laura, but I haven't been able to do the same for myself. I don't know if I ever will. I didn't forgive you to ease your guilt, she said gently. I forgave to free myself. What you do with your own conscience is your choice, Brandon. The man who had arrived with her approached discreetly, maintaining a respectful distance but clearly attentive to the dynamic. Laura noticed and gestured for him to join them. This is Philippe Moreau. He teaches art history at the Sorbonne. Philippe, this is Brandon Hayes, my ex-husband. Philippe extended his hand with European courtesy, and Brandon shook it, feeling simultaneously grateful for the formality and shattered by it. Enchanté, Philippe said with a pronounced French accent. Laura has told me about you. Nothing good, I imagine, Brandon replied, attempting lightness and failing miserably. She spoke with honesty, Philippe corrected, his hand naturally finding the small of Laura's back in a protective yet non-possessive gesture. About pain, growth, and moving on. It's all any of us can do after relationships that didn't work out. The kindness in the man's voice was almost worse than hostility would have been. Brandon nodded in agreement, his throat too tight for words. Laura watched him with an expression he could now read, something he had never been able to do during their marriage. Compassion mixed with firmness, forgiveness tempered with clear boundaries. I hope you are well, Brandon, she said finally. Genuinely. But you need to let me go. Not just physically, but emotionally. Carrying this guilt doesn't honor what we had or serve what we both need to build in the future. How do I do that? The question came out broken, desperate. How do I let go when I know I wasted the best thing I ever had? Laura took a step closer, and for a moment, Brandon saw the woman he had loved in his flawed way, reflected in the strong woman before him. You learn from it. You become better. You treat the next person with the respect you failed to give me. You honor what you lost by being who you should have been from the start. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. And you forgive yourself, Brandon. Not because you deserve forgiveness, but because carrying that weight forever helps no one. Philippe gently touched Laura's shoulder. Chérie, we need to go in. The event is starting. She nodded, then looked at Brandon one last time. Take care, genuinely. Then she turned, her arm entwining with Philippe's, walking towards the gilded doors of the hotel, where a life completely separate from his awaited her. Brandon remained on the sidewalk long after she disappeared from view, the fine Seattle rain beginning to fall, wetting his shoulders and hair. Around him, the city continued its nightly routine, indifferent to the moment of farewell he had just witnessed. It was then, standing alone as the water streamed down his face like tears his pride wouldn't allow, that Brandon finally understood what Laura had tried to teach him through her absence. Forgiveness wasn't about deserving, it was about release. And moving on didn't mean forgetting, but rather integrating the lessons into who you chose to become next. He walked back to his car slowly, each step feeling simultaneously heavy and curiously lighter. In the driver's seat, he pulled out his phone and opened the note where he had saved Laura's letter, reading the final words one more time. I hope one day you can forgive yourself. Perhaps he wasn't there yet. Perhaps it would take years, therapy, painful work in rebuilding who he was at his core. But for the first time since Laura had signed the divorce papers, Brandon felt something beyond crushing guilt. He felt possibility, the possibility that one day he could look in the mirror and see someone worthy of the love he had squandered, even if that specific love was irretrievably lost. He drove back to Fremont through the wet streets, passing familiar landmarks that were starting to seem less accusatory, more simply part of the geography of a life being rebuilt brick by brick. The small apartment awaited him, no longer a self-imposed prison cell, but a starting point, a place where he could perhaps finally begin the work of becoming someone who would deserve a second chance, not with Laura because that door had definitively closed, but with life, with future possibilities, with himself. Laura's letter would remain in the drawer, a reminder not of failure, but of unmerited grace and the responsibility that came with it. The responsibility to honor that forgiveness by becoming better, not for the person who granted it, but for the person he could choose to be from that moment on. And as the Seattle rain fell outside, washing the streets for another day, Brandon Hayes began, finally, the long journey back to himself.